mobile phones. Any other objects people have in their bag? Huh? Yeah, some people have lights and so on. Some people have a compass on their phones. 2 days ago, I was in Shanghai. Somebody said I had a knife, which I was slightly concerned about. And then you have other of these objects at home, and typically they're the objects you have in a drawer at home that you don't use very often. Or maybe you'd like to buy more of them in the future. So you can see the gap fill is fine, but as soon as I kind of personalise this, you just have to think a bit more and think about, do I have this object, don't I have this object? It's not a major change, but you're just having to work a bit harder to personalise things. If I want students to start thinking critically about this vocabulary, then I need to introduce some kind of problem-solving task to it. So I could put the students in groups, and I could ask them to do this. So they have to rank the objects in order of importance from most important to least important, and they decide what they're going to take in their groups. And what we've got now is students are really having to evaluate and analyse the language. One of the issues with critical thinking, though, as soon as I introduce problem solving, we've gone from an elementary task to something more sophisticated. Students have to think a bit more, but they also need language to talk about this. And the challenge for elementary level teachers is, how do we make the task critical thinking but keep the language level down? Because suddenly this exercise, students need to be kind of pre-intermediate, intermediate in order to do it. So we've pushed the language level up. We'll come back to that in a minute. But if you have critical thinking exercises, quite often it just pushes the language level up. But you can still use it at elementary level. Finally, so we've gone from lower order to higher order thinking. We want the students to do something creative with this vocabulary. So I could give them this task. And what I could say to students is, make sure you use 6 items of vocabulary. So I'd say choose 6 of these objects and include them in the story. And suddenly they have to do something creative with the vocabulary as well. So you can see how just with a set of vocabulary I've gone from lower order comprehension all the way up to creative thinking. And what it's done to my English lesson is make it more active. I've started to get the students to work harder, to think harder, and the likelihood is they're going to use that vocabulary a lot more and remember it more, because I've made my planning include critical thinking and creative thinking as well. So I find this a very useful model when I'm planning my lessons or writing material, creating material, for thinking, how can I do more with the material? I can just make it work a bit harder in that way. This is how we might integrate critical thinking into English language teaching. And I think critical thinking basically leads to 3 things in the classroom, and I think these are really important. First of all, it leads to students being more questioning and independent thinking skills. Asking questions is key to critical thinking. You want students to ask questions. In particular, you want them to ask why questions. Why is something like it is? It also develops your students' study skills, because ultimately you want them to leave your class and be able to think independently of the teacher as much as possible, but have the study skills to keep learning even without the teacher. And the problem with comprehension questions only is it all comes from the course book and it all comes from the teacher. And so the students just learn that's the only way you kind of learn. And we're not encouraging them to go beyond that and to think independently as well. And it's interesting if you teach exams like IELTS and so on, they're encouraging more critical thinking, and there are more tasks that require students to think critically and think independently. Critical thinking also leads to deeper processing of language. And I'll come back to what deeper processing is, but it's linked with the brain. And it's encouraging students to memorize language more effectively because they're having to do more with language. So the brain's working harder and there's more going on and they're making more use of the brain. So there's deeper memory of it. We'll come back to that. From the point of view of a materials writer and a teacher, any of you designing your own language activities and so on, language activities are just more fun, basically. If you think of your gap fill, a gap fill's fine, but when I ask you to personalise it and talk to your partner, it's just more motivating. It suddenly makes the exercise come off the page. Often teachers talk to me about course books and they say, oh, I need to do every exercise on the page, but also my job as the course book writer and the teacher is to get students' heads up out of the book and talking to each other and communicating. So always when I'm writing materials, I'm trying to think about how the students are going to be talking to each other in the class at the same time. We've got to have motivating classroom activities. And critical thinking activities, creative thinking activities, they get students' heads out of the books. What I'd like to do now is some practical exercises. So if any of you are teaching this afternoon or this week and you don't have a lesson plan, I'm going to try to give you some practical activities, but I'm also going to present them in order to illustrate these points. Let's start off with questioning and independent thinking. Pictures are fantastic for developing questioning skills. If you start a lesson, imagine it's Monday morning, 9 o'clock, and you open the course book and the topic of your lesson is the planet Earth, I could just show you a nice picture of the Earth from outer space or something, yeah, to start the lesson off. The trouble is, it doesn't demand questions. And I think the challenge is that we can start a lesson finding a picture that demands you ask questions about the picture. So when I'm choosing pictures, I'm trying to find something that instantly the student looks at it and thinks, well, what is this? Rather than the course book always just giving the questions or the teacher asking the questions. I want the student to look at it and think, oh, and automatically ask questions. So the test of a good picture for the classroom is, does it demand questions? So let's try a little exercise. You've got 1 minute with the person next to you. I chose this picture for a unit called the Earth. What I'd like you to do is look at it with the person next to you. Can you think of 3 or 4 questions you would ask your students if you showed this to them in class? Okay? Come up with some questions very quickly.